In the last video, we focused in on the bottom half of the divided line, otherwise known as the simile of the line. Again, in the text, Palomer lays it out primarily with a left-right distinction. I prefer the top-bottom division. I like to think of it sort of as though we're going to climb a ladder. We start off down here as young, innocent neophytes, and then we gradually make an ascent towards wisdom, coming to understand a much deeper reality. So at any rate, we focused in on the bottom half of the divided line, collectively referred to as the visible world. This is the world revealed to us by the senses, but as Plato argues, this gives us mere opinion, whereas again we want to make an ascent towards wisdom. So the crux of the issue down here is that this is a world of constant flux or change. And again, how can you come to know something that's constantly different, that's constantly changing? So if Plato is going to overcome sophistry and establish that knowledge is actually possible, not just an abstract theoretical definition, but the sort of thing that can actually be acquired or obtained, then the issue, according to his reasoning thus far, is that we need a world which endures. And this is collectively referred to as the intelligible world, the top half of the divided line, that is. Again referred to as the intelligible world. The bottom half is the visible world, revealed to us by the senses. The intelligible world we can come to know, as opposed to having mere opinions, not via the senses. Remember, Plato begins with a rejection of empiricism, but by way of reason, by way of the intellect, as intelligible there seems to suggest. This is his endorsement of rationalism. Knowledge comes to us not via the senses, that's empiricism, but by way of reason or by way of the intellect. And again, that's indicative of rationalism. So if the problem here is change, we need something that is permanent, something which endures, up here in the top half of the divided line. So let's just put Plato aside here for a second, because this quickly becomes confusing. Just think about your own education. Think about the different classes that you've taken, going all the way back to elementary school through the present. And think for a second of the different subjects, and which subjects maybe are a little bit more established, a little bit more permanent. Maybe you can imagine that you're going to become a teacher. What sort of subjects wouldn't require quite as much updating from one quarter to the next? And typically there are two answers that come to mind for most students: math and science. So the word that Plato uses is form. Hopefully at this point you've read about it in the text. I'm going to shy away from giving you a formal definition of a form. I can perhaps post that on Canvas. But my fear is that if I give you initially a formal definition, you're just going to kind of zone out. Maybe you write down in your notes, here's the definition of a form, and then you're going to think that you're prepared for the test. So instead of leading with a formal definition, we can do that at a later date. I want to focus in on not memorizing terms, but let's focus in on examples. So Plato makes this distinction between lower forms and higher forms, and at the very top, this will be a whole separate issue that we'll tackle later. I'm going to have you read a passage from one of Plato's dialogues, The Myth of the Cave, otherwise known as the Allegory of the Cave. At the top we've got the form of the good. So here's the whole picture laid out: lower forms, higher forms, and the form of the good, as we leave behind the changing world of distances down here in the bottom half. But what are lower forms? What are higher forms? So again, rather than giving you a definition, let's just talk in terms of examples. So for lower forms, and I'm going to use language quite loosely here, so I'll actually put it in quotes. We have scientific concepts. And again, I'm using language loosely, thus the quotes. I'll circle back around towards the end of this video and clean that up just a little bit. Not only am I using it loosely, but perhaps in kind of a misleading way. And then for higher forms, think math, or perhaps if you have taken the formal logic class, Philosophy 120. If not, math will suffice. Something as basic as 2 and 2 equals 4 even. So one step at a time, but just so you get the whole picture. There's the forest. Now let's take a look at trees. Lower forms, scientific concepts. And remember the time period, ancient Greece, we're a long ways removed from science. And in fact, it should be noted, you can't really accept Plato's hierarchy and get science. Plato begins by removing ourselves from the senses. It's not going to get us science. Science, by definition, is empirical. It's based on observation. It's based on sense data. So loosely scientific concepts. And we'll keep it real simple here. Again, remember the time period. Think of something as simple as, let's say, classifying different species. Let's keep it real rudimentary here. Think about what makes a dog, a cat, a cow, a horse, a horse. And of course, this is something that you're already familiar with, but this is what Plato refers to as a lower form, the form of the cat, the form of the horse, the form of the dog, so on and so forth. So to achieve an understanding of what makes a horse, a cat, a dog, etc., the path to knowledge starts down here at the bottom. So again, this is kind of why I like using the top-bottom distinction. We're going to make this ascent upwards towards knowledge. So this upwards arrow will be epistemology, where we gain knowledge, and this will end up looking like a mess. You can do a much better job, I'm sure, in your own notes. But again, we start down here as young, innocent neophytes. We make our ascent towards wisdom. This is the path to knowledge, or they've labeled it epistemology. So we start down here with particular examples. You might think of a little kid just learning to speak the language. So you go for a walk through the neighborhood, and as you're strolling through the neighborhood, you point out to the kid different objects that you encounter. You mouth the word, you point to the object, and you learn to associate that name with that particular entity. So you're strolling through the neighborhood, and you come across, let's say, a chihuahua, and you point to it, and you say dog. Now later on the walk, you come across a Great Dane, and you point to it and say dog. Now you can imagine, from the perspective of a little kid, this is, to say the least, kind of a head scratcher. What do you mean to tell me Chihuahuas and Great Danes are both dogs? But nonetheless, the point is, as you acquire different examples, different instantiations down here in the visible world, you can extrapolate upwards and learn to understand the concept of a dog, the form of a dog. You learn to determine what makes a dog a dog. And so maybe as you continue your walk, you then get out into the country where you come across a horse. And the kid points to it and says, as you might anticipate, dog. And that on the surface would seem to make some sense. Great Danes and horses maybe have a little bit more in common than Great Danes and Chihuahuas, which honestly kind of look like rats, don't they? But given a sufficient number of examples, you can eventually, and you're already there of course, determine or tell the difference between dogs and cats and horses, so on and so forth. So you extrapolate upwards. Different examples allow you to eventually come to understand the concept, using language loosely, or the form. And now here's the key. You can't come to know a particular sensible object because it's constantly changing. Each and every individual, first of all, is different. So I'll use horses as an example this time. All horses are different. No two horses, or people for that matter, are alike. All sorts of different types of horses: white horses, brown horses, spotted horses, race horses, the horses that pull the Budweiser cart. All horses are different. Each individual horse, and remember the issue down here, each individual horse is constantly changing. Starts off as a baby horse, and then it grows, it matures, eventually it grows old and dies. Sorry to upset you in this video. And then we turn it into dog food or into glue perhaps. But each individual horse is constantly changing throughout its life. They're all different, they're all temporary, insofar as they're only going to last so long. They're finite. Whereas the concept or form of, let's say again, a horse, that's much more permanent. Even if the day might come when horses no longer exist down here in the visible world, let's say at some point in the future, horses become extinct. Nonetheless, the form, or loosely concept, that will endure indefinitely. Even if there are no horses down here, we could still, thousands of years in the future, talk about the form of a horse. And of course, we now do this with dinosaurs. You've never seen a dinosaur down here, but nonetheless we can talk about what makes a dinosaur a dinosaur. This world is constantly changing, it's temporary, it's finite, it's flawed in various ways, not just an individual horse, but so it is for all of us. I am temporary. Eventually I'm going to unfortunately pass away. I know that's upsetting to think about. I am a flawed human being. I am imperfect in numerous ways, physically, mentally, morally, perhaps even. Character is always being developed. So these are changing, temporary, finite, flawed, imperfect, and here's the next step, copies of the master blueprint. And that's a lot to swallow. Imperfect copies of, referring to forms now, the master blueprint. So in terms of knowledge, we start down here, get different examples, and then we extrapolate upwards. We achieve a higher understanding, an understanding of the concept, using language loosely. So there's the path to knowledge, that's epistemology. But now here's the next step, this downwards arrow, I'm going to label as ontology. Ontology, referring to existence. So instantiations down here, individual sensible objects, are constantly changing, flawed, temporary, finite, imperfect. Each of us is flawed. But in terms of ontology, this world, the world of forms that is eternal. It has always existed, will always exist, has always existed, is neither created nor destroyed. This world is perfect. It is the unchanging master blueprint upon which all of this is based. Imperfect copies, the perfect master blueprint. And all of this initially sounds quite odd. Let me emphasize again this hierarchy. Notice the obvious relationship of dependence down here in the visible world. You can't have a shadow without a sensible object, and that makes perfect sense. Plato is now repeating that. You can't have a sensible object without a form. This is the imperfect copy, this is the master blueprint. So initially I use language like concept or idea or understanding. You achieve a higher plane of understanding by extrapolating upwards. That language is kind of misleading in that the forms aren't just concepts or ideas, they're not just mental constructs floating around in your head. Let me really emphasize this point. For Plato, forms mark reality as it truly is. So again, in terms of ontology, this world is eternal, never changing, neither created nor destroyed, has always existed, will always exist, and it makes this world possible. This one is contingent. So this world has always existed and makes this finite, flawed, changing world possible. And that's quite a pill to swallow. This means that let's say, any particular horse that you might be able to reach out and touch or get upon and ride, that would be an example of a sensible object. And for Plato, again, think about this hierarchy, this relationship of dependence. That individual horse, in some sense, is illusory. Reality as it truly is this world of perfect, eternal forms. And that's a heck of a lot to wrap your head around. And in fact, usually at this point, I get a decent amount of pushback. This is where perhaps the ad hominem abusives begin. Plato has clearly gone off the deep end. Maybe you were with me to a point. Okay, it kind of makes sense. Sensible objects are changing. How can you know something that constantly changes? Maybe you're with me there. Maybe you're with me on this path to knowledge. That's a horse, that's a horse. And then we achieve a higher plane of understanding, the concept of a horse. Maybe you're with me there. But now take it to the next step. Forms really exist. This world is in some sense a grand illusion. Why didn't Plato cut it short and say that the forms are just ideas? They're just concepts, they're just mental constructs. They don't really exist, and yet he doesn't. This is reality as it truly is. So if I've kind of lost you, or you just think Plato's gone, frankly, a little crazy, let me give you one last take. We'll do the higher form separately, and then later the form of the good. Again, in this video, I just want to focus in on the lower forms. So let's make things maybe not just confusing, but perhaps a little comfortable. Even if you think Plato's gone off the deep end here, let me suggest that for a decent percentage of the population, you actually accept everything that Plato has said. Maybe you're not accustomed to thinking of it in these terms. You're surely not used to using this language. Maybe you've never seen it sketched out in just a way, and I realize this is now starting to look like a mess. That is all foreign, but the basic worldview is one that you're all quite familiar with, and many of you, I'm sure, just based on our geographical location and public polling, many of you, I'm sure, do in fact accept. So this might be a little uncomfortable initially, but I want to emphasize the importance of Plato here and how he has shaped perhaps your view of the world, even though you think this is a little silly perhaps. Notice the strong and obvious parallels between Plato's divided line, his theory of forms, and many major religions of the world. According to many major religions of the world, how might we describe God? Compare that to the language that I've used here to describe forms. Forms, I've said, are eternal. They are neither created nor destroyed. They have always existed. They will always exist. They are the perfect master blueprint that makes everything else possible. According to many major religions of the world, might we describe God in those exact terms? God is eternal. God is infinite. God is neither created nor destroyed. God is the creator. God makes everything possible. Notice the language that I've used to describe sensible objects in the bottom half, the visible world. I frequently use terms like imperfect copies, finite, constantly changing, flawed, and so it is for human beings. We are all imperfect. We are all sinners. We are all imperfect copies of the master blueprint. Plato has an impact on what would become the Christian worldview. Not only does Plato impact all of philosophy, but Plato, again, has an impact after his death on what would become the Christian worldview. His importance cannot be overstated. Not only does he impact all of philosophy and help to shape the Christian worldview, Plato establishes essentially the first university, known as the Academy. Plato's Academy remained operational through the year 529 CE. And just put that into perspective here, YVC is one of the oldest community colleges around. YVC first opened its doors in 1928. I hope to be around for the 100-year anniversary, but for YVC to rival Plato's Academy, we're going to have to go until around the year 2700, the year 2800. He impacts all of philosophy. He helps to shape the Christian worldview. He establishes the first university, but you think he's silly. And if you did think that Plato was silly, but you do maintain this classical traditional worldview, notice how uncomfortable that becomes. And in fact, I think there are only two ways out of this dilemma. If you find yourself in that position, Plato's crazy, but you kind of accept the worldview that he's sketching out here. Well, possible way out number one, since you think Plato is a little crazy, maybe you should think your religious views are equally crazy. What do you mean you believe in things that we can't see? What do you mean that there's a greater reality? What do you mean that there's more to life than our earthly existence? What do you mean that there's a deeper meaning to our life here on Earth? Well, if you think Plato's crazy, maybe you think that worldview is crazy. The only other way out, I think, unless you're just going to abandon all consistency, is to say, well, Plato's not so crazy after all. There's a certain genius at work. And again, you're not familiar perhaps with this terminology, a form, certainly not familiar with the way I've sketched this out, but hopefully those strong and obvious parallels really sink in. Let me give you one last thought, a depressing one. Welcome to philosophy class. In studying the divided line, you're actually preparing for death. So according to many major religious views, not all, but according to many major religions of the world, in death, your physical body, of course, decays, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Your physical body would reside down here in the visible world. That'd be an example of a sensible object. Your physical body dies, but according to many major religions of the world, that's not the end of you. A non-physical soul survives bodily death. So according to many major religions of the world, the body and the soul are separated. And so it is for Plato's divided line. You're separating not necessarily the body and the soul, but you're separating the body and the mind. We grasp reality not by the senses, rejection of empiricism, but we grasp reality via the intellect, via the mind. And that's a heck of a lot to take in for one video. Now over 20 minutes. But I'm going to, on that awkward note, cut this a little short. I look forward to your emails.